There is a specific type of adult who apologizes before they ask for something, who shrinks slightly when they walk into a room they were not explicitly invited into, who works twice as hard as everyone around them and still waits for permission to believe it was enough. Someone who learned, before they learned almost anything else, that their presence was optional, that their needs were inconvenient, that the safest thing they could do was take up less space. Not because anyone told them this directly, but because no one told them the opposite. And silence, to a child, is a very loud message. If you recognize yourself in any part of that, this video is about where that came from. And more importantly, what it did to the person you became. The wound that leaves no mark. Most conversations about childhood trauma focus on what happened. The event, the incident, the thing that was done. But researchers who have spent decades studying attachment have found that some of the deepest wounds come not from what happened, but from what never did. The hug that was not given, the achievement that was not noticed, the child who cried and was met with silence instead of comfort. Psychologists call this emotional neglect. Not abuse, not cruelty. Absence. And absence, it turns out, leaves marks that are harder to see and harder to name than the marks left by presence. Because you cannot point to what was not there. You can only feel the shape of it, the outline of something missing that you spent years trying to fill without ever knowing what it was called. The experiment that never ends. In the 1970s, psychologist John Bowlby developed attachment theory. The core idea was simple. Children need more than food and shelter. They need to feel that at least one person finds them irreplaceable. That their absence would be noticed, that their distress would be met, that they matter, not for what they produce or achieve, but simply because they exist. When that need is consistently unmet, the child does not conclude that the parent failed them. Children do not have the cognitive equipment for that. They conclude something else entirely. They conclude that they are the problem. That if they were somehow different, somehow better, somehow less, the attention and warmth would finally arrive. And they spend the rest of their childhood running that experiment. Trying different versions of themselves, quieter versions, more impressive versions, less demanding versions. Searching for the configuration that finally makes them worth noticing. Most of them never find it. Because the experiment was never about them, to begin with. What it does to the nervous system. Here is what that does to the nervous system. Research published in the journal Child Development found that children who experienced emotional neglect showed measurably different stress response patterns compared to children who received consistent emotional attunement. Their cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone, remained elevated in situations that would not register as threatening to others. In other words, the ignored child learns to live in a state of low-grade alert, always scanning, always monitoring, always trying to read the room before the room reads them. Not because they are anxious by nature, but because their nervous system was trained in an environment where attention was unpredictable and approval could disappear without warning. That training does not end when childhood ends. It follows them into every room they enter as an adult. Every relationship, every workplace, every conversation where they wonder, before the other person has finished speaking, whether they are about to be found wanting. The cycle of earned worthiness. The adult that ignored child becomes tends to have a specific profile. They are often the most reliable person in the room. The one who shows up early, stays late, remembers what everyone else forgot, and somehow makes things work without asking for acknowledgement. Because they learned that acknowledgement was not something you asked for. It was something you earned. Over and over again, without end. Psychologists call this the cycle of earned worthiness. The unconscious belief that love and belonging are not given freely, but must be continuously justified. And so the adult who was ignored as a child tends to justify. Constantly, quietly, exhaustingly. Overperforming in relationships, over-explaining in conversations, over-accommodating in situations where simply saying no would have been entirely reasonable. All of it in service of a belief they may not even know they hold. That they are one wrong move away from becoming invisible again. What it looks like in relationships. There is a specific pattern in adult relationships that researchers trace directly back to this. And it does not always look like what you would expect. Sometimes it looks like texting back immediately, checking the conversation again 10 minutes later, to see if the tone landed right. Lying awake after a disagreement, not because of the disagreement itself, but because of the silence that followed. Measuring love by how quickly it responds. Other times, it looks like the opposite. Keeping people at a careful distance, not because they are not wanted, but because something in the body remembers what it felt like to need someone who was not there. And it decided, long ago, without asking permission, that it would not go back to that place. Neither pattern is a flaw. Both of them are the same child, trying to solve the same problem with the only tools they were ever given. The need to know whether they are safe before they allow themselves to need. Here is the part that is rarely said. The ignored child often grows into an adult who is extraordinarily good at caring for others, because they spent years studying what people need, watching carefully, listening closely, anticipating discomfort before it arrived. But that same person often has almost no ability to receive care in return. When someone offers them warmth without a reason, they do not know what to do with it. It feels suspicious, unearned, fragile, like something that could be taken back the moment they stop performing. And so they deflect it, minimize it, give something back immediately, so the debt feels balanced. Because the ignored child learned very early what it felt like to need something from someone who was not paying attention. They do not intend to go back there. Here is what the research says about healing. A landmark study from Harvard Center on the Developing Child found that the single most powerful predictor of recovery from early emotional neglect was not therapy, not time, not success. It was the presence of at least one person who offered consistent, unconditional regard. Not someone who fixed them, someone who saw them. Not the performed version, not the useful version, not the version that showed up early and stayed late and made everything work without being asked. The version underneath all of that. The one that is still waiting to find out if it is allowed to simply exist without justifying its presence first. That experience, researchers found, begins to rewire the nervous system in ways that years of self-work alone cannot reach. Because the wound was relational. And only something relational can find its way all the way into it. If you were that child, the one who learned to make yourself smaller, who mastered the art of needing nothing, who built an entire life around being indispensable, so you could never be overlooked again. This is what the research wants you to know. The strategies that kept you safe then are not character flaws now. They were intelligent, they were adaptive, they were the best available solution to a problem a child should never have had to solve. But you are not a child anymore. And the problem has changed. The work now is not to perform better. It is to slowly, imperfectly, and with far more patience than feels reasonable, let yourself be seen, without earning it first. Not all at once, not with everyone. Just enough, in one room, with one person, who has shown you consistently that they are still there, even when you give them nothing to hold. That is where it starts. Not in a breakthrough. In a small, quiet decision to stop disappearing before anyone asks you to. You have already survived the hardest part of this journey. The part where no one was watching. Mind Untold. If this video describes something you have carried for a long time without ever having a name for it, that is exactly why Mind Untold exists. Every week, we go into the psychology behind the things that shaped you before you were old enough to understand them. The patterns that followed you into adulthood, the wounds that do not show on the outside, the parts of yourself that finally deserve to be understood. If this is the kind of content that makes something click, subscribe to Mind Untold. And if someone in your life needed to hear this today, share it with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is show them they were never as alone in this as they thought.